Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're ready to start. My name is Peter Harkness, and I'll be moderating this session. My current title is Founder and Publisher Emeritus of Governing, the magazine, website, and events company that has covered state, city, and county government around the country for the past 28 years. As the title connotes, I am now semi-retired and getting fairly old. I want to welcome you to this CSG Academy webcast titled, How Does the Power Flow in Legislative Branch Federalism? One of the hottest topics in state capitals from coast to coast is the subject of federalism, ranging from fears about debilitating cutbacks from already committed federal dollars to questions about how to respond to a broad use of federal branch executive authority. Charged with advancing the role of the states in America's federal system, the CSG Federalism Task Force is pleased to present a three-part civics education series. This, the second of three Academy events on federalism's impact across the branches, will examine the current relationship between the legislative branch and state governments with a view toward providing a fuller understanding of the duties, powers, and limitations inherent in our federal system. Today's session will be recorded and posted in a few days to the CSG Knowledge Center website. We have a lot to go into in the next hour, and I think you'll find the commentary of our three panelists to be both intriguing and useful. First, I'd like to give you the background of our three panelists, then kick things off with a few comments of my own, after which I'll turn it over to the people who actually know what they're talking about. Then we will have our presenters respond to your comments and questions. This is a very important part of the webinar, and I'd like to encourage you to participate. If you have questions for any of our presenters, you can type it into the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Those will be collated in CSG headquarters in Lexington, and I'll ask as many as we have time for at the end of this webcast. Let me introduce our presenters. Paul Posner is the director of the Graduate Public Administration program at George Mason University, and he leads the University Center on the Public Service. He is the past president of the American Society for Public Administration and is a board member of the National Academy of Public Administration. His most recent book, The Pathways to Power, with colleague Tim Conlon, caps years of work on national policy-making processes. His work on federalism includes his book, The Politics of Unfunded Mandates, which won the Martha Dietrich Award from APSA's Federalism section. He was formerly with the Government Accountability Office, leading their federal budget and intergovernmental work for 14 years. I also should note that he writes occasional column for Government. William Hoagland joined the Bipartisan Policy Center almost 3 years ago as a senior vice president, helping to direct and manage fiscal health and economic policy analyses. Before joining the center, he served as Cigna Corporation's vice president of public policy beginning in 2007, working with Cigna business leaders, trade associations, business coalitions, and interest groups to develop Cigna policy on healthcare reform issues at both the federal and state levels. Prior to that, Bill completed 33 years of federal government service, 25 spent as a staffer in the U.S. Senate. From 2003 to 2007, he served as the Director of Budget and Appropriations in the office of Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. Finally, over the past 4 decades, Alice Rivlin has been one of Washington's standout figures in fiscal and monetary policy, as well as social policy and urban issues. She founded the Congressional Budget Office in 1975 and served as its director until 1983, creating an independent agency that continues to provide high-quality, nonpartisan analysis to Congress. She was director of the White House Office of Management and Budget from 1994 to 1996, helping to transform a large budget deficit into substantial surpluses by the end of the decade. She then served as the vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board from 1996 to 1999. In 2010, President Obama appointed her to the Simpson-Bowles Commission on the Federal Budget, and she also co-chaired with former Senator Pete Domenici the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force. Now she is the director of the Center for Healthcare Reform, the Leonard Schaefer Chair in Health Policy Studies, and a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, which is to say that Alice Rivlin knows how to stay in the eye of the storm. Let me note quickly that your moderator is not a policy expert, but a journalist who has spent most of his career covering government. First for 18 years with the Congressional Quarterly News Service, where he ended up as executive editor, and then for another 21 years with Governing, which we founded and with support from CQ in 1987. I changed direction in my career because I thought our company should do what most journalists everywhere want to do, which is follow the story. And in my mind, the story was beginning to move out of Washington, out into the country. As the disease of dysfunction crept into the Capitol, a trend became evident where certain legislation would pass through state legislatures that Congress might find, so many that Congress might find it palatable. Welfare reform was a good example, championed by Republican governors in Wisconsin and Michigan, then enacted by Congress and signed into law by the former governor of Arkansas, a Democrat. Cities, counties, and states would try new approaches. Ideas would spread, and soon Washington found it hard not to take notice. There was friction for sure, especially over federal mandates, though in my mind it was healthy. A somewhat self-important Washington press corps was slow to pick up on it, yet by the time George W. Bush was elected, 4 of the past 5 presidents had been governors. But that devolution process began to sour in the new century's first decade as Washington became more prescriptive and demanding while reducing available resources. It was a time of what the head of the National Governors Association, Ray Chapak, referred to as coercive federalism. The director of the National League of Cities, Don Bora, less delicately called it shift and shaft federalism. I'll leave it to Paul Posner to describe the current brand of federalism we are seeing. In the face of the Great Recession, states and locals were dealt a body blow from which they are only now recovering. Given that, I think things went as well as one could hope for with the advent of the Obama stimulus program, which turned out to be very sensitive to regional, state, and local interests. But the ideological polarization that has paralyzed Washington kept creeping into many state capitals, and now, on a range of social, environmental, educational, and economic issues, we could divide the states by color, red, blue, and purple. The fate of the Affordable Care Act will be a key political barometer of the future, I think, which is why I'm really glad we have Alice Rivlin with us today. One final thought. Though we are focusing on the states, the dynamics of devolution extend beyond federal-state relations to localities as well. Even though they have been slower than most states to recover from the Great Recession, locals also have shown fresh willingness to experiment with new ideas, to regulate when they see fit, and to defy the powerful interests that control many state legislatures. The state, local, regional fights over regulating fracking are a good example. So now, let's begin with Paul Posner. Paul?
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the history of our federal system and how it is going to be tested unlike any period I think we've had in recent times. Going to the next slide here, we can see that one of those articles, the Governing magazine, it's this first issue that Peter showed, has something called Fend for Yourself Federalism. And basically, when you compare our system to Australia and Germany, states and local governments largely are on their own to finance public services. The other systems, the national government does a lot more tax collection and redistribution to the states and provinces in their system. So there's substantially more fiscal autonomy, which is the good news for states, local governments, as well as the bad news in times of trouble, why that can be very, very difficult, as we saw in 2010, 2011. What's happened in the past 50, 60 years is that there's increasing interdependence between the levels of government, both in terms of financial transfers through grants as well as mandates and preemptions. And I think those of you in state governments, that's no news to you. And so basically we have this paradox. We have greater interdependence. There's very little that Washington does that doesn't involve the states, because we've made a collective decision to do more national programs, but not to hire legions of federal bureaucrats, but to rely on state and local partners to get the job done. A wise decision in some sense, but also one that leads to a lot of tension. Let's go to the next slide. That just puts a picture on that. It just shows some figures about the total amount of grants and aid, reaching 23% of state local combined expenditure. It's also 30% of state expenditure only. So this is not, this has become a significant and vital feature of state and local government. Going to the next slide just shows a picture of that, shows that grants basically have grown quite a bit since 1980. You saw a big leap up in the Recovery Act, which marked a significant new federal response of aid to the states. Another important thing this picture shows is that most of the grants are comprised not of payments to governments and school districts and transportation departments, but payments to individuals, largely from Medicaid. In fact, of the total amount, 73% of the money in 2014 from grants went to payments to individuals, largely Medicaid, the rest going for capital investment and other services that state and local governments fund. We go to the next slide that shows simply the grants have become the single most important revenue source for state and local governments in recent years. Let's turn to the next slide that shows the other face of federalism. This was the grant side is well, this illustrates that there was a stimulus program, again, as I indicated earlier, that provided significant new money, particularly in the early part of the recession, to the states that largely deferred the fiscal pressures that states and local governments felt, enabling them to keep teachers and highways and other programs going for a time until, of course, the federal government wound down its role. Let's go to the next one here, which shows, again, the unfriendly face of the federal role, which is the growing way the federal government preempts state and local laws in various areas. And you can see over the course of our history that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, this trend is really accentuated in lots of different areas, from banking to civil rights to health and safety, and it's continued in this century as well. And the next slide just shows that, if we can turn to that, the growth in mandates on state and local governments, which used to be considered out of the question for the federal government to do, increasingly has become often the way we do business. And that doesn't mean we don't fund those mandates to some extent, but often we don't do it sufficiently. The special education mandates, for example, the federal government provides about 16% of the costs that states and local governments pay for those kinds of services. Going to the next slide, I want to now kind of talk a little bit about the future. We're really about to see, as we've already seen, a kind of change in our economy and our government that's going to bring more pressure on the governments at all levels of government. And the particular challenges I want to face are the last two bullets, the aging of the population and the growth in healthcare costs. These are trends that all levels of government are struggling with, not just the federal government, that sometimes in our debates in Washington we tend to focus exclusively on the federal budget, but these are trends that have penetrated states and local governments, particularly states as well. If we can go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Again, this is a typical chart showing demography is destiny. We had a baby boom, and now we have a baby bust, where the average number of babies born is frankly too small to keep us financing the baby boomers once they get in retirement. That's the fundamental mathematical equation we can't solve, and we haven't solved yet through public policy, but we will have to solve. The next slide shows another feature of that in addition to more baby boomers living longer and healthier, demanding more funds for health care and Social Security, we don't have the kind of labor force to finance economic growth to pay for people like myself and others in their retirement years. And so it's really a two-sided problem. It's a spending problem, and it's also a revenue problem. We're not going to have a future economy able to productively yield revenues to finance these services. Let's go to the next slide, which shows that just a little bit more about those baby boomers and when they really start to generate their big turn toward retirement. And you can see we're in the starting to come into the throes of that great demographic storm. Why don't we go to the next one, where we see the result of this, and the GAO and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office that Alice Rivlin founded, and the OMB are all agreed that over time, if we do not raise taxes, we're going to see deficits rise from their current levels to levels that, under certain assumptions, could equal 10% of GDP, assuming we don't do anything. Now, that's unlikely, but nonetheless, this just shows the logic of our current fiscal policy path at the federal level. We are in for some really hard times over the coming years by virtue of the fact that the government, under this scenario, is going to be able to do little more than pay for the elderly and their doctors and bondholders holding federal debt. That's not a good picture for those who believe in schools, infrastructure, and the like, and their importance to the future of the nation. Let's go to the next one. That, again, shows how the composition of spending under CBO's numbers is projected to change. And you can see that in 2013 versus 2038, while the federal spending for Social Security and health is going to jump considerably, the rest of government is going to decline significantly. And the other major category on the far right, you can see, is payments, interest on the federal debt that will be growing. So the major growth factors are these entitlement programs in health and Social Security and the resulting interest on the debt. And the shrinking sector that's going to pay for all this, assuming we don't raise revenues, is the discretionary spending and defense spending in this country. Let's go to the next slide, where we can show what happens in some notable funds. This is the report that was issued just a week ago on the Social Security and Medicare trust funds that shows that within the next 10 to 15 years, why the Medicare trust fund and then the Social Security trust fund are going to be without any assets to pay benefits. And that creates a significant crisis that would be better if we averted sooner rather than later. The dotted line is the Disability Trust Fund, and that's going to go broke in 2016. That's just next year. Let's go to the next one, where we see if we continue the current policies, which is really represented by the somewhere between the green and the blue line, it shifts a lot. This was a table done by the Bipartisan Policy Center a year or two ago. Why it shows that we're going to be very, very shortly, if not already, being at a level of non-defense discretionary spending where much of our grants for infrastructure and education are funded from, below our historic low represented by that purple dotted line. In other words, we're on a trajectory to have historically low levels of discretionary spending at a time when the nation is increasing its population and the economy is demanding more, in some ways, public service rather than less. Let's go to the next slide. So that's the federal story. The part that isn't as well known is the state and local story with regard to their impact of these trends on them. And you can see the GAO has been doing these long-term models that show that there's a prodigious state and local fiscal gap. In other words, the dotted line shows the spending that state and local governments would have as a share of the economy if they were to maintain balanced budgets, as most of them are required to do. The purple line is GAO's projection of what their spending would be, assuming these trends continue, the retirement of the elderly, the growing pension obligations on states, and the health care costs, payments under Medicaid that states are so vitally involved with. And it shows that basically the two don't add up. The states are going to face a growing gap between balancing their budget and financing these new additional fiscal pressures from these entitlements in their budgets. Let's go to the next one, which shows, again, the same story at the federal level. If you project out over the long term, you can see that the healthcare spending by state and local governments is going to dramatically increase as a share of the GDP, almost by double, while the rest of the state and local budgets are going to be pinched to make up the difference, essentially. And it's the same story, again, we see at both levels of government. You're going to have to pinch that limited fiscal balloon in the section where many people think that spending is already too low, which is infrastructure, education, and the like, and in the interest of paying, as we say, elderly and their doctors, essentially. Let's go to the next one. There's other pressures that the states are going to face. The shrinking sales tax base as a share of personal income. The sales tax base used to be the way states funded quite a bit of their revenue, as declining as a share, partly because of the growth of the service economy, which is not reached by sales taxes, the growth of the internet economy, which is also not reached effectively by sales taxes. So while they're facing spending pressures on the revenue side, things are not looking so well either. We go to the next one, which shows that the funded ratios of pensions, assuming that we use the riskless rate, this is done by the Center on Pension Policy at Boston University, illustrates what happens, that states are now really experiencing reduced levels of funding for their pension plans. So what we know, and what we know by reading the press and the governing magazine and the like, is that pensions are becoming an increasingly sore spot in state and local budgeting, and a future claim that many states are having to reckon with at a big price for the rest of their budget and for the tax rates of their states and their local governments. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, as the federal government struggles with its own deficits, the question is, will there be collateral damage to the intergovernmental system? Will the federal government kind of work collaboratively with the state and local partners, or will there be kind of efforts to, obviously to deal with federal deficits, possibly at the expense of state and local governments? And what we've done here is just shown that the recent federal commissions, particularly the Simpson-Bowles Commission, showed all of these kinds of recommendations were made, particularly as part of that commission. The elimination of the state and local deduction, tax-exempt bonds, reduce discretionary spending, capping and consolidate long-term care for Medicaid, and the like. None of these, and revenue nationalization, which was introducing a value-added tax, which actually could be a productive revenue for states, and I think that came from the commission that Dr. Rivlin was chair. None of these are inherently bad ideas. It's just collectively they will really have an impact on state and local governments in the financing area that will be something that they will have to reckon with. So let's go to the next chart that shows basically the American public during the recession didn't exactly support additional federal aid to states. In fact, it felt that by large majorities that states should take care of their own problems. Not a promising venue for the states to ask for more federal money, particularly when federal money is hard to get. Let's go to the next one. I hope by now that those of you who care about the federal system are suitably depressed. In any case, because it's a situation that shows there are storm clouds over the federal system. Now, when we think about what are the strategies that we could use, it's not necessarily bleak. Clearly, we can do the first one, go it alone federalism, and arguably we've done a lot of that in this country. Each level of government works on their own. And the second one is shifting costs, which, as we've said, has a significant price. The third one is fiscal coordination, and I think there is some promise to achieve greater collaboration. Let's go to the next slide that shows the areas that I think we could, all levels of government have a stake in reducing and rationalizing healthcare costs. All levels of government have an interest in economic growth and infrastructure, and all levels of government may have an interest in improving the base of taxation to cover a greater share of the economic benefit, which could include a value-added tax or some other kind of consumption tax. So there are a case to be made for fiscal collaboration as all governments struggle with this elephant that they're all wrestling with, which is the lack of money in an aging society. But finally, if we can go to the final one here, let's skip this one a minute, and I want to go to the next one. The question is, do we have the institutional basis to work together across levels of government. In 1980, we had institutions, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, many other agencies in the OMB, the GAO, the Congressional system itself, had committees that were specifically institutions devoted to this partnership. Now, we don't, essentially. So that's the real question for our system. How can we jointly capitalize on a great challenge to all levels of government by working together? Right now, we have a lot of institution building to do. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much for that cheerful report. Next is Bill Hogan. Bill.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are. It's Bill Hoagland. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be on this webinar with Dr. Posner and Dr. Rivlin. First of all, I want to congratulate the CSG on its focus on federalism initiative. But let me begin, maybe also being a downer here, the Debbie Downer this afternoon following Paul. Back in May, Bloomberg, there was an article in Bloomberg. It wrote that the executive and legislative branches of the federal government were missing in action in not responding to not only the largest municipal bankruptcies in U.S. history, but also to the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, which, of course, as many of you probably know, failed last evening to meet its debt requirement. Today we have profound changes, it seems to me, in federalism. And as one pundit wrote recently, the torch of intergovernmental federalism has moved from to the federal courthouses, where the judiciary is increasingly displacing the executive and the legislative branch in arbitrating the federal role in the states and municipalities. Indeed, striking to me and probably to Dr. Rivlin, there was a provision in the budget that Congress adopted, its blueprint, its budget resolution back in the spring, a provision of singular discrimination, I think, barring, quote, so-called bailouts to municipal corporations, cities, and counties going forward. This is an extremely difficult time, it seems to me, as Paul has outlined, and in terms of the fiscal issues, but also in terms of the relationship, just the overall historical relationship between the federal government and states and municipalities. I want to cover just two quick items here in the interest of time. First of all, a little bit of a restatement of Paul's message, just to drill down a little more in that area on fiscal austerity and what it means. And then, however, let me close with a few comments on one of the major challenges that Paul's raised, and we all know, and that's the healthcare issue and healthcare reform law, and maybe some possibilities here for states and localities, particularly states, to advance their role in our federal system as it relates to healthcare going forward. A couple of quick slides here. The first slide up, please. Just to highlight, and as we go forward here, just to put it into perspective, in terms of all our fiscal projections are based upon a set of economic assumptions. And I just wanted to highlight here that for the fiscal year, that the calendar year we're in right now, you will see here these have been there's been some revision since I put this chart together, because the administration has done what we call a midterm adjustment. It's not happened with the Congressional Budget Office. Will also do one, but has not issued it yet. I just want to highlight that for the current calendar year, even the administration, which had projected back in the winter that we'd have about a 3.1% growth in the economy this year, is now revised that down most recently to 2.1, lower than the most recent blue chip or the CBO estimates. They have stuck with a growth in 2016 at 3%. It's always striking to me that about inflation. You also see that the blue chip, most recent blue chip, this is July, has only about a 0.3%, and again, the administration revised that 1.4% down to 0.2%. Very little inflation. The slightly good news, I guess, is that on the an anticipated rebound of that growth rate up there, maybe with and lower inflation coupled with a tightening of the labor market, we do see some improvement in the unemployment rate going forward, both going from about 6.2 down to below 5% in 2016. One of the most important little variables that I like to look at here is this 10-year, these interest rates, and I'll come back to this in just a second. But as you will see here, that the consensus seems to be that those interest rates will start growing back up, and the consensus is that the Federal Reserve will begin later this year, possibly as early as next September, or this coming September, the 16th and 17th at their meeting, a month from now, to start to raise that. This is something that I will leave to the Vice Chair of the former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, Dr. Rivlin, to address if she wishes. But it's important as it relates to going forward in what we'll find very quickly here in a minute. Just let me go to the next chart, please. All this put together, you need to know, Dr. Posner did not go into this, but as you can see here, the red line is the projection of where we are headed at the federal level on our fiscal situation. And you can see the current trend, even with this level of economic growth, and largely in part because of what Paul outlined in terms of the changing demographic structures and demands upon the federal fisc, you see that the red line shows going down. But I want to highlight the blue line there, which is what the Congress has adopted back in the spring, which claims that they'll get back to a surplus by 2025. If I can go to the next chart, please. Here quickly, there's a lot of numbers, but I just want to highlight a couple of them. There have been this is to show you that the federal, if you look at 2015, the fiscal year that we're in here, that's going to end at the end of September, you'll see that we spend at the federal level about $3.7 trillion. We take in about 3.2, and so the deficit is somewhere around $486 billion. And that's quite frankly has had most recently the administration has re-estimated that to closer to about 455. But nonetheless, as you look out, it doesn't seem to change that much going forward, all the way out to 2025. And in fact, that the deficits will grow at an annual rate over this 2014 about 8.8%. But that's the number that doesn't concern me as much as, quite frankly, as the one down below shows the federal public debt, which has accumulated close to about 74% of our economy, a high by historical standards, and continuing to grow as we go out into the future. I could go to the next chart, and that will simply be a reflection of the debt, as you can see, that it is at a historical level compared to 1940-45, of course, post-World War, or during World War II. The next chart, please. And what's driving this is, as Paul has highlighted, if you look at what are the major factors in terms of our federal spending, it is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, taking care of our, and just paying the interest on the public debt. But look down there, domestic discretionary. That is the area where Paul was talking about by 2020 it represents less than 11%, and that's the area of the federal budget where most of the pressure has been applied. If I can go to the next chart, please. And here's the point I was getting to as it relates to interest rates. As those interest rates out there, those 10-year, as the Fed starts to raise its interest rates, we have been very lucky, as you can see, with low interest rates over the last decade or so. But as those interest rates start to normalize, the fastest growing component of the federal budget, at least, will not be Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, but will simply be the payment of the interest on the debt that we have accumulated. And I would highlight, as I'm sure others know, but that today about close to about 60% of our debt is not owned by United States citizens or banks, but is owned by foreign investors. Thank you very much. And that takes away a little bit of our sovereignty, it seems, going forward. But that the critical factor here is that interest rate, as those interest rates start to come back and grow, there's going to be a major drain on the federal budget just paying the interest on the public debt. Next chart, please. And I'll skip over it. Let's skip this one because this is the same one I think Paul had highlighted. Let's skip over to the Social Security. We'll skip this one too, trust funds, that same chart that Paul showed. And now let's go to what really you should be concerned about from a state perspective. And that is, again, a lot of numbers, but let's look what we're dealing with, and we're going to now transition a little bit into the current situation in Congress. And the current situation in Congress is that, as you'll see under 2016, for that component of the federal budget, where the grants, most of the grants, the discretionary grants for highways, for education, investments, infrastructure, research, those are in this area, that 11% of the federal budget, the non-defense discretionary. And what you see here is in 2016, if Congress sticks to its current plans and going forward, it is basically reducing the amount of spending between 2015 and 2016 from, if you can see the numbers there, 534 to 493. Those are the caps, and Congress has said they're going to stick by those caps for non-defense going forward. And you'll see that over the long term, just through 2021, that's actually, in nominal terms, a reduction in resources available non-defense going forward. Again, just highlighting what Paul has already highlighted, and that is the pressure that's being put on. I can skip the next chart, please. And now go to that one. And so where does that put us? That puts us in a situation where this fall, Congress is left, as the Senate will be leaving here in a couple of days for its August recess. The House is already recessed. They're not coming back until after Labor Day, and the fiscal year, the federal fiscal year, begins on October the 1st, of course. And right now, no appropriation bills have passed in the United States Senate. A limited number have passed in the House. We now have a new issue which developed last evening in the United States Senate as it relates to family planning and that issue is unfortunately going to complicate this fall's exercise of getting those appropriation bills done. And it is my thought that what we're dealing with then going into this fall is a real potential for there being what we would call a continuing resolution, simply funding government, which may be in some ways, given those lower cap numbers, if we can fund next year's 2016 at last year's level as we get through 2016, it might be even better to have a continuing resolution as it relates to resources available. Not that I like continuing resolutions, but it's clearly we're headed in that direction, if not an omnibus appropriation bill that will carry us all the way through next year. So those sequester levels do come back in 2015. We have now forced the transportation highway bill into the fall. We also have, remember I'm talking about the debt limit earlier. We will reach our statutory debt limit sometime toward the end of November or early December. So we have the perfect storm once again brewing out there for this fall in terms of funding for these particular programs that you're interested in at the state and local level. Let me see the next chart, please. I think I want to, and I guess while we have an economic uncertainty, we have political uncertainty moving forward. And I just want to highlight, as we get into the fall, post-Labor Day, we all know we're starting the political circus of elections, both congressional and presidential. And in the United States Senate, unlike 2014, the number of seats up have switched from Republicans to Democrats, the number that are at risk. And so we can expect there to be a very tight, Republicans wanting to retain control of the United States Senate particularly. It's going to be very difficult issues and careful issues going forward in that regard. So let me just shift here to talk a little bit about health care and close out here. Clearly, there are major challenges in cost to states. Paul, Professor Posner has highlighted the cost of Medicaid and long-term care. And that will continue to be, it seems to me, the current Affordable Care Act will continue to be a major political football going into this fall. I'm sure we'll hear about it in the debates this Thursday night, and certainly as we get into the primaries and the general election next year. I anticipate, you should expect that there will be a repeal vote once again in the United States Congress, when they come back after their recess, there'll be a repeal vote. They can, under some maybe arcane political budget process procedures, they can pass without a filibuster and put on the President's desk a repeal of major provisions of the Affordable Care Act. But it will be vetoed, and it will be a messaging document. But in the vein of federalism, I would like to highlight one area the CSG might want to look at, and I'm sure has maybe, and I presume has already begun to focus on. It's something that's referred to as 1332 waivers, or the Wyden-Bennett Amendment, named for those two senators. It's a section in the Affordable Care Act that allows for states waivers to the law to allow for wider latitude in how states run their insurance and marketplaces, regulate health plans with the caveat that they can have a great deal of flexibility as long as they meet the law's major goals of providing affordable coverage. Interesting also that it has whatever those waivers approved are, that the states have to remain budget neutral as it relates to the federal government, can't increase costs to the federal government over a 10-year period. They have to provide coverage to at least a comparable number of its residents as is under the current law, and they have to prove that cost-sharing protections against excessive out-of-pocket cost will not occur. I understand that Arkansas, Minnesota, New Mexico, Hawaii have created working groups to look into the possibility of these waivers. Rhode Island legislature has authorized the state to pursue one, and California lawmakers, as I understand, are opposed to do the same. California, interestingly enough, is interested in waiving the requirement that current ACA requirement that does not allow for illegal immigrants to buy private plans. California is pursuing that and letting to let their overall healthcare system spread their healthcare safety net. And Arkansas is also moving in this regard. I only raise this because these innovative waivers, I am not a fan necessarily of having the states come back to Washington to ask for waivers in these particular areas. But I do think as you are thinking through at the state and local level what options you have, this becomes effective in 2017 and could make a major difference and helpful, and maybe in some ways help address some of the challenges that Dr. Posner has raised and others have raised as it relates to the pressure and cost that places upon states going forward. Because this clearly is, unless we find ways to control this, and that would impact directly states' Medicaid programs, then it will continue to put extreme pressure on our ability, the federal government's ability to provide those, increase their funding for infrastructure, transportation, highways, education, and the things that used to be part of our discourse of federalism between the federal government and the states. I'll close there and turn it over to Dr. Rivlin.
Thank you very much. This is Alice Rivlin. We're running out of time, so I will be very brief, and I also want to narrow the focus somewhat, but pick up on where Bill left off, namely with the Affordable Care Act. Because I think the Affordable Care Act offers a huge opportunity to the states to think hard about what sort of health care system they really want, given the demographics and the economy and the special history that each of the 50 states have. Now, that kind of flexibility is not what you ordinarily hear about the Affordable Care Act. It's described by its detractors as a great federal power grab, but actually, if you read the legislation, even before you get to the waivers that Bill has described, states have a lot of flexibility, and they will, as Bill says, have more. Now, it's true that the objective of covering more people was imposed on states that might not have wanted that, although most people of all political parties allege that they do want broader insurance coverage and more choices for individuals, more affordable health care. But the states were given enormous flexibility in how the Affordable Care Act went forward. First, the choice on the exchanges, whether to have a federal or a state-managed exchange. But even if the state elects to use the federal exchange, states still have a major role. Insurance regulation, after all, is a state function. State insurance regulators decide on the rating areas within which insurance companies will compete for the business of those eligible for the Affordable Care Act. They determine the adequacy of networks, that is, what providers are in a plan's networks. They review premiums. They decide whether to allow people to keep plans that don't meet the Affordable Care Act standards if they want to. And furthermore, the Affordable Care Act relied heavily on Medicaid, a state federal program, to increase coverage for the lowest income uninsured. Many states, after the action of the Supreme Court, elected not to expand their Medicaid programs, though some are rethinking that decision. And the states that elected not to expand Medicaid were left with a gap in coverage. Medicaid has always had a waiver process, and the standard waivers, known as 1115 waivers, can be used to restructure the state health system, provide more flexibility for the states, and help fill that Medicaid gap. But as Bill has pointed out, that's nothing to the flexibility they will have in 2017. The success of the Affordable Care Act, or indeed any major piece of legislation, depends on implementation. And implementation in this case will play out largely at the state level. We've already seen variation in the success of the Affordable Care Act at the state level, different rates at which people are enrolled depending on what the states actually did. We here at the Brookings Institution are engaged in studying, along with the Rockefeller Institutes of the States, that kind of variation across the states with teams in 40 states. So my bottom line is this is a 50-state experiment. It will evolve over time, and there is huge potential for the states to develop their own version of what expanding coverage means, what kind of structure of healthcare system they want. If the exchanges are working well, they can expand them, put their Medicaid program on them, and use a choice among private plans as their dominant mode, or they could pull back and do more in a government-run healthcare system itself. The choice is up to the states, and it's going to be a very interesting and exciting ride as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. As you all can tell, you did not tune in to to Comedy Central by mistake. This is a rather distressing set of talks we've had today, but we have to face reality. And in doing that, let's have some questions. I have one quick one for Paul Posner. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations seemed to be something that was desperately needed at the time. If anything, it's even more needed now. What are the prospects for a reestablishment of some organization like that to try to make sense out of all this in Washington?
Well, a number of us have been trying for the past, almost 20 years to get it resurrected, with little or no success. And I think that's telling because it suggests that this issue of intergovernmental collaboration, while we all pay rhetorical homage to it, is really not on the high priority list. We do, as Dr. Rivlin said, accommodate the flexibility in individual programs, but in terms of taking a look at the big picture and finding ways to achieve the bigger kind of settlements across governments, that doesn't seem to be in the cards right now as much as it is needed.
Then, Alice, let me ask you this. I said in my opening remarks that I thought what happens with ACA would be a barometer of how healthy or poor relations between Washington and the states are. What's your prognosis about that? We've talked about flexibility of the states in the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of states do seem to be taking advantage of that. Do you think that that is a trend that will continue, and is that good for citizens?
I do think it's a trend that will continue. I also think the Affordable Care Act is working quite well in most states, almost all states actually, including many that did not want it. They had Republican governors and Republican legislators, and they were not in favor of this act. Nevertheless, it has been implemented with quite good success everywhere, and the flexibility built into the act long before you get to waivers is meaning that states get to shape it a lot, even before they get to the waivers. So I think if things go well, and I expect that they will, I'm not in your doom and gloom group, that we will have increasing state variation within the limits of providing coverage for everybody at a certain standard, and it may mean after a while that we have very different systems of delivering health care in states with different philosophies and different histories.
Yeah, I agree. I'm actually not in the doom and gloom group either. My thought was that as slowly states began to expand Medicaid, more did, that the pressure on those that hadn't would get greater and greater, and that this administration at least has shown some willingness to be flexible in figuring out something that will work for them. Is that correct?
Well, I think so, and remember that even if states didn't take advantage of the opportunity to expand Medicaid eligibility, a lot of them had more people flocking into Medicare under the old rule, Medicaid into the old rules, just because more people knew about it.
I see. That's interesting. One for another one for. Yeah.
I'm not in the doom and gloom category as it relates to health care in this country. I think that it's going through a wonderful, dynamic, innovative, exciting period here. It's frustrating, but I think so. I want to be clear that on the doom and gloom side, my doom and gloom is more on the broader fiscal issues, not specifically on health care. And just let me also say that to the extent that I believe all health care is local, be honest with you, unless, as somebody once said, unless you're rich and you can fly across the country to Mayo or wherever, not everybody can do that. But since it is local, anything that you can do to provide for that flexibility to get the decision-making back down at the local level, I think is good for health care and for beneficiaries out there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when I was saying this is not Comedy Central, it's really the numbers that you and Paul showed, which are the numbers I've been seeing for quite a while, about we have to change because the walls are closing in on us financially, and but healthcare may be actually a bright point. Let's see, I had one up on the screen here, but it's just popped away. Bill, you pointed out the biggest growth in interest is going to come from interest in debt rather than Medicaid or Medicare and so on. Is there any hope that this will turn around, and how might that work?
Nope, not from my perspective. I think interest rates will go up. I think we've been very lucky, and again, I shouldn't be commenting on interest rates. That really should be the former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, Alice Rivlin, to say. But I think they're going up, and just the bottom line is we've accumulated a lot of debt, and we're going to just have to pay more interest. The rate, by the way, it's the rate of growth. We still, dollar-wise, will be paying less than I guess we will pay for the Department of Defense, but it's the rate of growth that scares me, and that was that 19% annual rate of growth that was put up on the chart.
Now, the only way to turn it around is more revenues or less spending over the very long run.
I have to think so, yes. It's interesting. I just wrote a column about pensions, and I said if the United States has a Greece, it's Illinois, and Illinois has its Athens, which is Chicago. Anyway, that is about all the time we have for this afternoon's Economie webcast. I want to thank our guests again, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. This webinar will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center, so if you missed any part of it, you can listen again or send the link to a friend. Be sure to keep an eye on csg.org to find out about future events in the Economie series, not only on transportation or finance or anything or any other policy areas. Please have a good afternoon.